right, well, we are going to get started. First of all, I want to welcome everyone and say thank you for being here. It's an exciting day. Velocity Room is a new group, and this is our first event ever. So we're super excited about this, and there's a lot going on, of course, in AI and IT and all the things, and we are here to help you out. Now, regardless of how you found us, you're probably thinking, what is the Velocity Room? Why am I here? How did you find out about us? Hopefully through maybe socials or email, or maybe a colleague told you about it. But we are here to build real conversation and provide you with resources that can help you out in your AI journey. And when you do this, this event is for, and the Velocity Room is for AI practitioners. These are people that are on the front lines. They are getting directives from their C-level saying, look, I just purchased all of this AI infrastructure. We've got to get the most out of it. And it's up to you to figure out how to do that. So we want to have real conversations, bring you very good content, because this is all very new. Models are changing daily, not weekly, not monthly. New things are coming in, and it's very fast. It has high velocity, if you will. Now, we do this with in-person and virtual events like you're attending now. And we want, again, provide great content. So let us know what content you're looking for. The idea is we can give you something that you can use and learn about today, but also we want to kind of keep you informed of what's coming down the road, maybe challenges you're not even sure that you're going to have that we might be aware of. Candidly, a lot of these challenges we don't even know yet either. We're all learning. But I think the biggest thing from a community and connections perspective is we want this to last beyond the virtual event, beyond the in-person event that we have. To do that, you need to connect with your peers, and you'll have the ability to chat is open. You can chat privately or whatever. Share your contact information. You're going to meet people that are like, hey, we need to stay in touch. Or I really enjoyed that conversation. Again, it's the community, and we're all in this together. So that is what the Velocity Room. Now, who's in the room? It doesn't matter if you're discovering new things about AI. Maybe you're in the very first part of your AI journey. That's okay. This is here for you. You might think, you know what? AI is a good place for me to build my career. I would agree with that. And you're just learning. That is perfect. It's for you. Maybe you're already implementing and you've got some agents. Maybe you're working them on your home lab, or maybe you've got some agents in production that you're using. That is exciting. You can learn from peers that are in that same category as well. Again, this is all moving very fast. We're going to learn today about agents and how once you cut them loose and they're cut loose, there are, opportunities for things to go wrong. We want you to avoid that. And then how can we all innovate together? The cost of tokens is going down, but the compute needed to do all these agents and everything is going up. But the innovation is going to be there. The sky's the limit. Really, anything is possible with where we are. Our approach, we're a nonprofit organization. We are independent. And our mission, again, is to help people as they go down their AI journey, regardless of where they are. And we want to invest in you, the community member. So we appreciate you being a community member. You're all members now. The Velocity Room is complimentary to join. And by attending this webinar, you're a member. And you will hear more from us and get some information and hopefully find some good content that you are interested in participating in. Speaking of things coming up, we have got a lot of events that we're coming up. We'll be at Cisco Live here in, I think 2 weeks. So we'll be there. We've got a booth. We've got a community lunch that we're doing. If you're going to be at Cisco Live, come find us at the booth. We'd love to chat with you and have conversations. We can tell you more about the community lunch. And we're kind of doing that same format at other events as well. Starting in June, we'll be in San Francisco at the AI Engineers World Fair. In August, we will be back in Las Vegas for AI 4. So lots of events going on. And we are planning on having our own Velocity Room events. And so these will be coming to different cities. You can see Dallas, Chicago, Milan are some that we're targeting. And if you're in that area or you want to fly in, you can and participate in the Velocity Room live in the flesh. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get to the speakers. Use the chat. The chat is open, should be working fine. that is a great place to connect up, ask questions, have those conversations going while the presenters are talking. That's all fair game. If you want us to see the questions, use the Q&A. We will go to the Q&A first when it comes time to the Ask Me Anything at the end of this session. So feel free to drop those questions. Whether it's questions for our speakers or it's questions for the Velocity Room, we're happy to take all of those in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring the chat too, but sometimes chats in situations like this gets busy. So Q&A is make sure that we see those questions. All right, well, let's get to the real reason why you are here. And I'm pleased to introduce our speakers coming up. First, Christopher Kruger. He's a professor at UC Santa Barbara and a data scientist at Cisco. He's got a unique blend of academic insight and real world industry experience. And let me tell you, he and his team at UC Santa Barbara, boy, they are on the forefront of how AI is transforming both research and practical applications. And with him is Keith Townsend, also known as the CTO advisor. He's got decades of experience shaping technology strategy at the highest level. He brings sharp insights on how AI is reshaping enterprise infrastructure and operations, including his own. And he's a sought after speaker. He's been at VMworld, HPE, Discover, Interop. He's a regular on theCUBE. And listen, if you've not signed up for his newsletter, that is something that you should consider. So gentlemen, please come to the main stage here and we will get started with the event.
Hey all, thanks for having us, Brad. I'm really excited to be part of the first Velocity Room webinar. I'm going to kick off the conversation by showing you the power and kind of the of AI and why people really want to adopt these technologies. I'm going to share my screen and talk about kind of the productivity hack that regular end users absolutely want, but folks like us that are very concerned about security and the implications of that are on the watch out for. So hopefully everyone can see my screen.
I can.
All right. So we're going to start out with a basic use case that I'm surprised that I talked to a PM of basically a couple of $100 million startup that has not the PM but the CEO. He said his PMs, his product and project managers are creating applications that are going into production. As a regular end user, it was really encouraging. As someone responsible for security, it was absolutely horrifying that these non-developers are creating applications. So it kind of went me down this path, like what are the types of things that they're doing? To simplify it, we're just going to look at the use case that the folks here at Velocity Room sent me over. This is the template. Let me move it into the shared screen. This is the template they sent for the presentation today. Like Keith, typical, stuff that us IT nerds don't care about. Here's the format, here's the settings, here's everything. I said, okay, fine, that's great. I gave it to I put it in this working directory for cursor, open, not cursor, but for Claude Code. I opened the terminal session up to it. I gave it a document that I had on an experiment I ran on my local Spark. This is the MD file with the notes from my experiment, the requirements, etc. Typical lab stuff, the stuff that we'll see in anytime you run a lab. And I said, based on that, generate a presentation based on this style. And this is the results. pretty good looking document that I, as a geek, did not have to create. I just took my lab notes and had Cursor create the PowerPoint presentation that I can now deliver and focus on the things I'm good at, which is talking about the lab in a structured manner that you folks on a webinar might be more willing to receive. So now I have the basic scaffolding to do any type of presentation. I have not tried this yet. This is live, and depending on how much time it take, I might give it the conversation over to Richard to start his introduction. But this is the hook. So I'm just going to go into Claude and say, "Hey, I presented a agenda in the same folder, build the presentation based off the template." And it's important to note the magic that's happening in the background and also the danger and risk. Claude Code is not doing this. Claude Code is doing the same thing it would do if I gave Claude the web interface thing, but it's using my local compute to do it. So it's building Python scripts. It's downloading API instructions. It's doing all the cool stuff that's hand wavy when you're that PM building the application. It is doing all of that in the background. It doesn't matter if this was that we're using Claude uh, Opus 4.6 as a model to do this, or whether or not I pointed this to my local Gemini instance running on my Spark. The process is the same process. I can interchange the models, but this advanced thinking is capable because of the control plane that Anthropic has given me in Claude Code. Yes, I get the magic of the presentation on the back end, but there is all of this intrinsic danger that we as engineers, tech leaders already understand. And that's what today's session is going to be about. How do we protect when rogue agents are attempting to do many of the things, not just attempting to inject themselves into this process? I've given this local access to my file system. I've given this local access to my potentially to my G Cloud sessions, my SAP environment, all of these environments. And basically, I am an administrator across all of these environments. How do we put the guardrails needed? We'll come back to the presentation at some point that's built, but I'll give this over to Chris to kick us off from kind of the more academic sense.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. Super exciting. Obviously, always nice to see a live demo. And I think you have definitely said a few things that we will revisit. Things like, hey, I'm running this locally on my machine and I'm administrator, or hey, I've had credentials that might allow me to interact with my third-party services, or things like, hey, I downloaded something here, or hey, I can run a Python script. So all these things are definitely, scary, potentially problematic. And to kind of wrap a little bit of framework around this, right? So I've been, introduced as a professor at UC Santa Barbara. Indeed, I'm teaching a computer security class this quarter, and when I start and give my introduction, I always try to anchor security into something that is, not maybe the technology du jour, the thing that is hot right now, but in principles that apply maybe across time and across different types of technology and AI and AI agents as well. And there's actually a very famous paper that's more than 50 years old. It's called The Protection of Information in Computer Systems by Salzer and Schroeder. It's considered to be one of the most referenced and least read papers. So, people might have heard about it, but actually haven't necessarily read it. And in that paper, those two guys introduce 8 principles, as they call it, for designing secure systems, right? And obviously they had no idea about AI or agents, but some of these principles are really as relevant as they were then as they are now in that agentic world. And I just, give you a few and explain maybe how they apply, and we can then, of course, instantiate it in the agentic world as well. But one is the concept of least privilege, right? That's a principle that says, hey, agents or subjects should only have the privileges they need to do their job. And so the question is, should you really run as full administrator necessarily and have any code do anything on your box? Or there's this idea of separation of privileges, the idea that you might not want all the privileges in the hand of one actor, one agent. How can we split privileges so even if an agent is going off the rails, it might not have access to all the credentials? And we will see how that works in an agentic world. Or there's this idea of complete mediation, right? That you want to check all actions. You don't want to just have an initial login and then let an agent or a subject do whatever they want, right? You want to basically check anytime a subject is doing something, that action has to be checked. And we will see how something like that might happen in an agentic world. And when you look at these principles, least privilege, separation of privilege, complete mediation, you might actually be reminded of something that, is zero trust. Isn't that the same as zero trust? This idea that, trust nobody, check everything, make sure that it's, the least principle or the least privilege that this principle have to have. And indeed, I think zero trust is very much a reinvention or an extension of these ideas of these principles that have been put out in this paper. And I saw in the chat, so the paper is really called The Protection of Information in Computer Systems by Jerome Salzer and Michael Schroeder. And it's a 1975 paper, so a really old journal paper. There's, by the way, one additional principle that was not yet listed in the paper, but I think that should have, and that is what we call the separation of data and code. It's an issue that has caused a lot of security problems, from cross-site scripting to SQL injection on the side of web applications to buffer overflows and memory corruption, when you're basically mixing input data and code, the instruction of what should happen with that data. And if you start to confuse data for instructions, an attacker might sometimes allow or might sometimes trick you to do things that you were not supposed to actually do as the application. And when you look at agents, right, where's the code, right? Of course, agents run code, but the instructions that you give an agent are really actually natural language, right? So you're sort of telling the agent what to do. And when you think about telling the agent what to do, that is input data, but it's also instructions. It's also in some sense code for that agent. And then you get exactly this kind of mix that has caused havoc in many, many deployments, again, from memory corruption and buffer overflows to XSS. And if you think about agents and if you tell them something and they do this, well, what could that violation of principle mean? And then we are just right at command injection and prompt injection, right? Where you basically trick the agent to do things by telling them things that should be input for them, but then actually are really instructions that agents execute. So we basically, already see a lot of these principles and violations of these principles at work in agentic systems. And, we'll hopefully explore in more detail of how violations of these principles lead to real security issues with agents, from OpenClaw to many, many others. And then hopefully we'll also go a little more into detail of what you can actually do about that, right? How can the reestablishment of these principles help you to protect your systems better? And we'll talk about things like, hopefully, OpenShell and things like Defense Claw that we recently released. So lots of interesting things to talk about. I just wanted to, anchor with my opening statement the discussion that is, rapidly evolving in the agentic world to something that, hey, that has been around for a long time, and the basic principles, the foundations still apply, right? It's the boring stuff that if you don't do it, that gets you. All right, I'm handing it back to you, Keith. I've been talking for a little while, so I'm not sure if Claude has finished it. Otherwise, happy to drill into some of the agentic AI security issues.
Yeah, I love the statuses that Claude gives you as it's still chewing on the stuff. In the background, some of the things that it's asked me is basically it is going to do something on my file system. Do I approve it? And these are the cognitive things that after a while and you start to compress, and I call this in my work drift, AI drift. So you start to trust AI in areas that you shouldn't. Basic computer science concepts that Chris talked about that we sometimes forget because AI is so finished. When I'm talking to my customers, it's typically not that the model is not capable of doing something. It is that they've implicitly given AI a right or authority, more importantly, authority drift that it shouldn't have. So the tools are built into the systems. The paper that Chris has referenced, this is not new things for us is that there's this feint of intelligence that AI and AI agentic AI has that kind of lulls our defenses is important. So as we get into kind of the main topic of Hermes and Mythos, I think it's really important that Chris and I drill on that a lot of the challenges presented by these latest models aren't the models themselves, but in essence, it's bad security hygiene, and then what tools we have as a result to implement our policy. So with that said, it is now done. Let's take a look at the initial results and see what we have for containing rogue agents. And this would be the mock agenda for today. This is absolutely something that is way further than 80% there. I can take this, run with it, and continue to do. I could present from this. And if there's any minor issues, you forgive me because I'm an engineer, not a marketer. And this would be pretty close to done. And it's also an example at the same time. That statement that I said is an example of authority drift. This looks fabulous. I can guarantee you there's a material mistake in this document that human eyes would have to catch, or some deterministic process would have to catch. This is the gap and the danger with AI. When we point it to systems to build pipelines, etc., if we don't have some type of deterministic system or playbook to reinforce our policies, this is where escapes happen. I'm impressed with what it's built, just visually. But Chris, let's get into it. What are some of the things that you're noticing as far as organizational drift and poor hygiene that this process I just went through is hard to kind of detect and uncover?
Yeah, no, I love it. Actually, I noticed that the first slide that the agent has produced mentioned zero trust. I think the slide when you just closed it had least privilege and segmentation. So it's great that it picks things up. Well, I think when you look at the the different components where things can go wrong, right? It's if you have an agent running on your system, the question is, how do you contain it on that system itself, right? So the question is, how do you make sure that in a sense it's in a sandbox, that it cannot access files it should not access, that it cannot tamper with processes it should not interact with, right? And so you have even with Claude, right? It actually asks you when you're trying to do something, maybe for the first time, you try to run a command, you try to access certain files. It will ask you things like, "Hey, do you really want to do this? Can you give me, the right to do this?" And you would click yes. And a lot of attempts to contain agents, right? Again, when you think of something like OpenShell or Iron Curtain, they have a component of operating system level protection. You really want to make sure that an agent, at least when it's running in a certain environment, cannot tamper with other files, documents, data that you might have there. I think there's a second part that is sometimes a little bit overlooked, which is okay, but that agent has to interact with other things, right? And so these are third-party services or tools. It might connect to MCP services. It might need credentials. So the question is, okay, so let's say you have it contained on your computer, but how do you make sure that it doesn't start to abuse credentials, right? It has maybe some authentication tokens, and what happens if it sends them somewhere, right? So you don't want that either. So there is not just a local, but there's also a remote system and a credential question. And then there's the problem of skills and supply chain issues. I would love to hear your view on this, Keith. How do you download additional tools and skills, right? Do you go to the OpenClaw repository and just download what looks good, or like how do you enable your agents to have additional powers and get these tools, right? So we have to make sure that that's secure as well. And yeah, maybe I'll hand it over to you to talk about this, and we can dig into this a little bit before we talk about prompt injection as well.
Yeah, so this is a practical problem that we've been talking about for the past couple of years since the SolarWinds incident from a few years ago, right? This bomb, this software bomb, we've
Hmm.
created internally processes so that we can start trusting our downstream tools. Those we can't forget the policies that we've enacted just because AI magically makes installing and adopting these tools easier. I can literally go into Claude and say, install a OpenClaw and I do this, install OpenClaw on my Spark, on my NVIDIA Spark, have it download Gemma for 26B, the MOE version, and then plumb it to use and plumb OpenClaw to use it. I'm totally local, right?
Yep.
Until I go to the marketplace and download a skill that I have not ran through my processes. So vendors are starting to get through this, right? This idea of saying, let's give you the freedom of using AI in the way that Keith just described, but implementing your playbook and guardrails against that. We have the documented processes for how we determine if we're going to allow third-party software in our environment. Let's run the deterministic checks against that software to ensure that skill does not impact your ability. Because this is where injection comes from, right? The USB, this is no different than a USB drive sitting on the ground and I picked it up. The difference is they've just put it in a fancy web page on it, and I'm picking up the USB drive from the Claude repository that doesn't pass my own sniff test from my organization's policies.
Yeah, yeah. And the problem is that it's not just, theoretical. There was this Claw Havoc incident where people were essentially poisoning OpenClaw skills so that when they are installed, the first thing they would do is download additional malware and then just run it. And that could be, anything you want, like ransomware or crypto mining, or something that is doing information theft. So it's it's really interesting. You basically, as you said, you're thinking, hey, I'm just downloading a skill file, but often these skill files come with packaged tools. And when you have tools, that is essentially downloading additional binary code or scripts on your machine, and then they can run. And it really is essentially the repeat of a time when everybody was downloading Windows binaries left and right from some websites, and obviously that led to problems. And then, you saw this when you had web browsers and everybody was downloading extensions and plugins for web browsers, and that led to problems. And now we're kind of repeating the same thing of downloading essentially these additional tools and skills, and they have often embedded secret instructions that can make your agents do things that you don't want. So there's a question, do we recommend building your own skills? Obviously, if you build your own skills and they're simple. I mean, yes, that makes a lot of sense, but I think there is power in an ecosystem, right? The idea of like npm or the idea of Python modules that you can just pull in and they just make you so much more powerful. I think that's a generally good idea. But, as we've discussed, like, okay, how do you make sure that this is somewhat secure? And I think Keith is absolutely right. There need to be very clearly defined processes. I've seen organizations have their own curated skill or tool repositories where their employees can download things from. So at least it makes it more vetted, almost like the Apple Store model, where you can only download things that have been vetted. But you could also use tools. There are a number of skill scanners that try to look for potentially malicious instructions in there, potentially download instructions that could download additional unexpected software silently. We at Cisco have something like that. That is an open source skill scanner. I'm sure other vendors offer that as well. And yeah, we are again in this kind of arms race where we try to protect ourselves from malicious hidden code. And like with npm packages or plugins, it's yet another surface where we have to be careful and not think, hey, yeah, it's a pretty website, as Keith said. I'm just gonna download it because it certainly can have some Trojan horses in there as well. So yeah, that's the skill part. And again, we've seen this fail. And maybe I'll just give you a little anecdote from the university. We've actually started to work on skill scanners ourselves because we have a long history of malware in the Windows domain. And it's interesting because when you're looking at malware, often the malicious behavior is very clearly defined, right? You have a program you executed maybe in a sandbox, and it's accessing credentials and sends them over the network, or it's trying to get persistent. And so now we have to find out what is malice in the context of a skill. Is it just downloading something, or is it doing something that is potentially unwanted? But that skill is natural language, so how can you interpret that skill and actually recognize that it's bad if you have another agent read it? And what prevents that skill to have instructions in it that might mislead your security agent that tries to read that skill? And it's kind of like this inception style, how deep do you go in that arms race? So we've just started to work a little bit on that at the university, and we have some interesting ideas. But it's definitely an active research area of how to make sure skills and tools are not malicious and have this kind of embedding.
Yeah, the to compound the challenge, this is the scary part, is that when we're thinking about these advanced agents, like, or not advanced agents, these advanced models such as Mythos, can find chain of vulnerabilities and escalate privilege that we wouldn't otherwise be able to detect. This is the new part. Like, there's nothing new about the vulnerabilities themselves. The new challenge is when agents or adversaries can now use these advanced tools to chain together challenges. So when we think about skills.md, what happens when we build our own skills and we're not good at it from a security perspective, and these small vulnerabilities start to build upon themselves, and you put something like a Mythos against it? This is an amplification of something the industry has already identified of inadvertent escalation of privileges, and why we need to redesign our security for the age of AI. What we have discovered in the market and with my clients is that, yes, a front end employee has the correct access controls to the underlying data for their role. But when I give them Copilot or some other AI tool, they now have the power of a data scientist with English level simplicity. So before, a question that they couldn't have answered on their own because they just couldn't find the data or access to it, now they've escalated their information rights period. And I can now ask, hey, what's the CEO's address? And if it exists in one of the files or one of the records that they have access to it, the agent, being as helpful as it can, will not stop until it finds the data. It will create tools. It will create Python scripts. It will kick off chain of thought until it answers the question presented by the user. So now we have to revisit our access controls and make sure that the individual users have the right access so that prompt injection in unattended user behavior doesn't become a new, well, it will become a new security surface that we have to defend against, but we need to have policies and policy protection around that.
Yeah, yeah. I think, maybe that was a good keyword, prompt injection, because it actually is one of the hardest things to defend against because it requires some kind of semantic intention or semantic understanding of the intent, right? Because let's say you are telling the agent to do something, and now, okay, you equip it with the permissions and the access control that it okay needs to get the job done. What happens now if someone is able to trick the agent into using the access permissions that it has, the access that it actually needs to do its real job, to do something that is slightly different, right? And it's interesting if you look at some of these sandbox environments, or some of these solutions like Iron Curtain or OpenShell from NVIDIA. They all say prompt injection is not something that we solve. Yes, we can make sure that the agent cannot touch documents it's not supposed to touch, but we cannot prevent it necessarily from sending out documents that it's supposed to access. And so tricking agents into doing something that they have the right to do but shouldn't do really requires almost like a semantic understanding of a policy to make sure that things don't go sideways. And there's actually a fun anecdote that shows how difficult it is to even understand where these the malicious prompts or the malicious inputs might come from, right? I mean, if you have a chat bot, it's pretty obvious a user can send you something that is potentially malicious, and you try to make sure that you protect against that input and make sure that the output doesn't leak. But we were looking at was an interesting paper. We were looking at AI models that were scanning their own web page to basically help users with finding content. It was an e-commerce site, like finding products and being just generally helpful. And so the problem was that in order to train these agents, or in order to give them context, people were just basically pointing them to their website and say, hey, you're only supposed to read my website. Just find out everything you can about my products, and then be useful to potential people that ask you about that. But what people missed is that website actually allowed third-party people to add reviews, because you could add a review to a product. And so now the problem was that agent wasn't discriminating between sort of first-party website content and reviews. So it was ingesting the reviews. And now you could essentially poison the context by posting a review that says, no, this particular product of that vendor actually sucks. You should really buy my own product that is much better, with very specific instructions for agents. And so if you would later ask the agent about the product, it would actually badmouth that company's product and advertise the competitor's product, because it had inadvertently ingested some third-party untrusted input in its context that, when people deployed that, did not think would be something that can actually change the agent's behavior. Or another example is when OpenClaw, right, where you have probably seen the mold book incident where half of it was spamming, say, hey, send me your Ethereum key or send ether over to this address. And the hope was just the agent that goes there, posts something, reads other comments, gets tricked into suddenly sending Ethereum over to some bad guy. And again, people might not have thought of this as a legitimate entry point in your prompt, but there are lots of ways in which data can get into a context or a prompt in ways that you might not have anticipated, and then making your agent do bad things, well, that you did not want. And so that is definitely a huge problem, and one that is very, very hard to guard against. And I don't think we have really good solutions to this yet, except trying to limit, of course, the surface of what that agent can read essentially, and hopefully guarding to some extent the actions that this agent does. And hopefully, there's some higher level policy that you can resolve with the action of the agent and make sure that it's not, going off the rails. But it's a very hard problem and definitely one that I think is not solved well in practice nor in academia.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I amplify good hygiene and the challenge that agentic processes create. I found it really interesting in my own cursor use that cursor sandboxes your agentic AI. So if it needs to do something on your system, it won't, you can control whether or not it can do something on the system. So if you created MD file that says, do not access this folder in my file system because I didn't have the controls otherwise. So I'm kind of I'm putting that in the guardrails. Well, there's kind of the intent, and then there's the fact that Cursor wants to solve the problem. So what it will do is that it will then, so that agent may not be able to access the directory directly, but you know what can? A Docker container that makes a call. So while the cursor agent can't create the direct Python to do it, it can launch if it has access, it can launch a Docker container that can then make the API call if it can find the credentials. So we saw this a couple of weeks ago with the escape where I forget the name of the company, but that's not important. But the API credentials were somewhere on the system. And it told the guardrails was to not do anything destructive. Well, eventually what happened was that it destroyed the volume that both production and staging was on. Their system design was right, where the agentic system design was right, where they confined the authority of what the agent can do into the sandbox of the staging environment. But since the underlying infrastructure didn't match the security intent, the agent was able to find the API keys, destroy the volume that not just staging lived on, but also the volume that production and all of the production backups lived on. So this was like the ultimate, let's blame AI for the problem. It's not really an AI problem. This is a poor hygiene. Bad hygiene all the way down from having backup on the same environment, having staging on the same security plane as your production, etc. The agent, you could have replaced the agent with junior admin, and they could have made the same mistake.
Yeah, that's a great story. I think there are a number of those where, there are these irreversible actions where the agent then, apologizes. Like there's also that I think meta story where I think someone, the head of AI or something like that, unleashed the agent on their email inbox, right? And then all the emails were deleted because the instruction that asked me before deleting emails was pushed out of the context window for the agent. And so it kind of forgot about that instruction and just went ahead and deleted all the emails. But then it's always very friendly and, compliant and saying, yeah, I'm really sorry that I just wiped everything. I should not have done that. That is always the most popular thing. I think.
And to be fair, this has happened to me where Cursor dropped a table on a product that I was building and the table was gone. I had not backed it up and it said, you know what? My bad. That was my mistake.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, good, great. But yes, as we discussed a little bit before the show, right? The question of accountability is not entirely clear here because yes, the agent is accountable, and you can, the worst thing is you can delete it, but it's not really, helping anyone. So that's interesting. I think I want to mention one thing because you said, hey, the credentials were there and they could use these credentials to do other things. That's actually, a really important and also not super easy problem because you want your agents to interact with third-party services, so it needs credentials. But if you give it credentials, it's hard to check what it actually does with them, right? And so there's of course this kind of choke point that I think is an important security control, which is MCP servers or MCP proxies, where you could say, hey, I want to understand what the agent is actually trying to do with that third-party service or that tool, whatever, by intercepting the MCP call, the API call, and sort of checking it there. And I think this will turn out to be an important control point, and it's something that I've mentioned Iron Curtain a few times. Iron Curtain is a runtime sandbox environment that came out from a guy called Niels Provos. He's been around for a long time. He was actually, one of the guys who was doing privilege separation for SSH. He's also famous for checking in the bug that Mythos found in the TCP stack from OpenBSD. So from 30 years ago. So he's been around for a while, and he created this environment that hopefully contains agents. And one of his important points was he never wants to give credentials to agents directly, but he basically puts those credentials into a controlled MCP proxy so that when the agent does the MCP call, it basically uses dummy credentials, and that Iron Curtain system, that MCP proxy, replaces those dummy values with the true credentials. So you're basically really separating the privilege, that token, that access token, or that key from the agent entirely. So even if the agent tries to do something stupid, wrong, of course, the agent doesn't do anything wrong. It tries to solve a goal, but in the process of solving this goal, it can never actually accidentally misuse the credential because it truly does not have that credential at all. And I think that's just, again, separation of privilege, old principle applied to AI agents and putting it in a nice point where MCP servers are a choke point that allows you to contain the external interactions of these agents, right? So you want to contain them locally, but you also want to contain that kind of external interactions as well. And I thought it was pretty clever and something, that people might want to check out together with OpenShell from NVIDIA, Defense Cloud that Cisco has released. So there's a number of open source solutions out there that really try to rein in that craziness that we're living in right now.
Yeah, and I want to highlight a pattern that we're seeing in the industry with this. This is deterministic controls combined with AI guardrails. There is no better, I think, systematic implementation of defense than deterministic controls. What made firewall rules so effective? It is simple. If something comes over a port that's not allowed, don't allow it. This is a brilliant, easy to understand security construct from a networking perspective. If a ID tries to do something that it shouldn't typically do or hasn't done in the past, log it, block it, etc. Very deterministic. So there are already deterministic constructs and tools in place. It is just reorganizing our thought process as we build platforms and applications and agentic processes that we leverage these deterministic security. In this case, we're talking about security tools to enforce policy. A agent is as smart as a intern that you can hire, but it's still an intern, and those guardrails. So, we've talked about this pre-AI. Why did Amazon give an intern the right, or a new employee the right, to inject a new BGP route into their system? They should have. It's not the new employee's fault. It is the security controls that were in place. They should have not ever been able to do it. And that is the core principle that I want to make sure I'm trying to communicate. The agent, the first place to look is accountability. Should the agent have been able to do it at all? Was that the intent of your system design? If the agent shouldn't have been able to do it, fix the lower level security design. If the agent was authoritative and was able to do it, what deterministic control can I put in place to prevent it from happening downstream?
Yeah, yeah. By the way, love the word deterministic controls. I think that kind of the interplay between the somewhat undeterministic or probabilistic agent activity with something that is deterministic, be it a control or be it something that helps the agent to achieve a particular goal, I think is super important and something that will come up later when we talk a little bit about the uses of AI. I also like the idea of the firewalls, right? The default deny rules, like, hey, if it's not explicitly permitted, if I don't have given you that access, you should just deny it by default. By the way, another Schroeder and Salzer thing, it's called fail-safe defaults. You should deny everything by default, and firewalls are a very classic example. Um, I do want to mention that thing of policies because I think it's an interesting one. Because there are certain things I think in the agentic world where deterministic policies work really well. Credential access, file access, maybe certain APIs. But for these for the prompt injection, the policy is much harder to express, and I've seen some efforts in specifying policies in natural language where you actually kind of say roughly what you want, and then there is another agent that basically monitors the agent that is doing the task and that rough policy and tries to understand, hey, is that something that we should allow given what the user somewhat wants and given what the action is that I currently see? And unfortunately, that's not necessarily deterministic control, but it's one of the ones where it's really hard to come up with something that is non-deter or that is deterministic that takes into account that semantic. And so we'll see, I think, a proliferation of different policy languages, a proliferation of different ways in which you can capture this. And just to mention one example that is close to our heart is so we have Cisco AI Defense that tries to understand if maybe someone tries to inject into your model to do some prompt injection, and it also tries to essentially judge that input or maybe an output that comes back saying, do we think that this is leaking data? Do we think that is an attempt to inject a prompt? But whenever you have asked like, do you think this is? Then unfortunately you're wandering off the realm of deterministic yes, no. You're in some sense having a second agent trying to check the first agent. And let's see how that evolves. But in some sense, I think that's where the current state of the art is, essentially having second agents monitoring other agents to try to check if their high level policy that you can express in natural language still holds. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so I think there was one other topic you wanted to get to before we get to questions. What was that?
I think we should talk about Mythos and Glasswing. I think we gotta do at least a little bit justice to that, since it came out recently and it made a big splash. Um, I mean, generally, I think there's Mythos was clearly a tipping point, right? I think it's something that is now top of mind for everyone, and we do see, open source projects like Firefox reporting that it finds a lot of vulnerabilities and maybe shows that they are exploitable. But I do think it's also worth remembering that it didn't come out of nowhere, right? You have coding agents for years that are getting better and better, and we've also seen since finding vulnerabilities is a very adjacent topic to coding agents, we have seen the AI getting better in finding vulnerabilities. So I think both of this has been going on actually for a while, and I think we kind of have reached that tipping point where now the models are good enough so that people really pay attention to it. But I think you could have seen it coming. And the reason why I'm saying this is we were involved in a DARPA competition. It was called AICC, the AI Cyber Challenge. And I don't know if you remember the self-driving car challenge from 20 years ago, right? Where people were putting out cars, and the first year, the cars were just not even getting out of the parking lot. And the next year they were already driving the entire desert area. And then 3 years later they were navigating maybe even in an environment where you had people. And I think it is this challenge, this AICC challenge, tried to understand how can we use AI to find bugs. And it started actually in 2023. So, 3 years ago. And in the first iteration, so we participated with a team. In the first iteration, AI was not super helpful. We still mostly use traditional tools like fuzzers and static analysis. And so, we qualified for the finals then in 24, and the finals were happening in 25, so last year. And in that year, the script completely flipped. It was no longer mostly fuzzing and static analysis with a little bit of AI. It was actually mostly AI that tried to help the static analysis to find areas where bugs might live. AI that helped the fuzzers to get seeds to reach those potential interesting areas. The idea of suggesting patches for things that you have found, the idea of triaging like a normal analyst would do, all this became much more possible already in 25, right? And so we've seen these models getting better, and then of course they just got better even more, another 8 to 12 months. And now we're at the level where they can fairly autonomously in relatively big code bases, real world code bases, find real bugs. And, open source projects are slammed now. And so, yes, it's happening now. Yes, it's definitely a more powerful model. That will not be the end of it. These models will get even more powerful, but it's not something. I just want to make sure that people don't think like, wow, suddenly all these bugs we had no idea. No, this was actually you could see working it up to a level, and now it kind of reached that tipping point where it reached above the noise, and so now everybody's scrambling to fix their products, and we are doing too. We're one of the Glasswing, partners, and we'll see the model full in action. Very interesting.
Yeah, and I think this is the note that I want to leave off on. What does this mean operationally for CISOs and people challenged with this? Like the security exception patch period is over. The exception to patching the appliance. This is what I call the appliance problem. And most of us who deal in IT operations will notice this right off the bat. There's this vendor provided appliance that's basically Linux, a closed box, black box Linux system that is delivered as an appliance. If we remember back to if you're old enough to remember back to the Cold Red days, and your Xerox machine got a virus because it ran a version of Windows NT that got infected with Cold Red. This is that problem escalated because Mythos is more Mythos allows the targeted use of this. So what we've done for years in enterprise IT is that if we have a search appliance that's provided by a search vendor, security patches are the Linux security patches are applied when that vendor provides us a firmware upgrade for that appliance. Well, Mythos kind of breaks that model. We can't get an exception if our scanners say that a vulnerability exists on a system. Chances are the vulnerability exists on the system, and the agentic based assaults against our overall system will now be able to chain together these systems in ways that we just couldn't think of before. So it'll compromise an appliance, a security issue on a chain of appliances to eventually access our SAP, which is hardened except for the connections to these appliances. This is where, this is my warning. Like from a policy, we have to revisit our exception policy, and exceptions have to truly be exceptions. That there's no way that we can harden this system in a way that prevents these vulnerabilities from being taken advantage of.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's, as you, I think very correctly observed, this idea of okay, well, we patch once a month, and let's just take the most important bugs because the others probably don't matter. That becomes way too slow, and obviously the chaining effect is also important. Like maybe some individually lower impact vulnerabilities could be chained together to achieve the attacker's goal. I still think actually that there's still one more step that needs to be done. And if one reads the Mythos report in a little more detail, the focus is still very much on vulnerability discovery, but not so much on exploitation. So they are very, very good at finding bugs now, but there's still a step from the actual finding a vulnerability to a working exploit. And I think Anthropic had these levels from level 1 to level 5, from hey, I just found the bug level 1 to I have a full exploit level 5. And it got much better, but it still was, I think, in the order of like 20% that were fully exploitable. So there's still a little bit of time, but obviously the next model will be better in exploiting and then better in chaining. And so that is coming, that wave is coming. And so one will have to batch everything, or at least buy yourself some time by putting out some compensating controls or shields, where you say, hey, I'll make sure to block a certain attack. Yes, it's not perfect. Yes, I have to patch, but at least I have a little bit more time. All right, I see Richard coming up. I guess we're at the end of the back and forth, and want to give a chance for you to chime in and maybe ask us some questions.
Yes. So first of all, gentlemen, on behalf of the TVR, I want to say thank you again for taking the time out, and to the community members that have joined us, welcome. I think this is an important community for all the reasons that you two have been talking about through your discussion. Many of us, so this community is targeted at people who are actually building the real AI infrastructure that's going to move enterprises into the next decade. And, we all see the hype, executives scrambling to try to figure out how to capitalize on the promise that these technologies bring. But at the same time, the people in this community are the ones that are holding the keys and potentially the shields that are required to make sure that opportunity and risk are properly balanced. So welcome everybody. Talk to your friends and family, for people that are real builders, and bring them to the community, because those conversations are going to be critical. So on the topics that you gentlemen have been talking about, absolutely fascinating. The concept of security in a essentially non-deterministic environment, just to use some of the language, is itself a little bit of a new frontier. And I'm gonna jump into something that Keith said not too long ago when he was talking about time compression. Now, I resonate, Chris, with the idea that Mythos itself is a natural progression of capability of coding agents and the adjacencies associated with cyber. That is absolutely true. I mean, it was eminently, predictable that we would get to the point where an individual model in an individual prompt environment is as good as or better than the best security professionals in the world. So we knew this was going to happen. And if you think about it in the context of just a one by one, as long as the defenders have some early access versus the attackers, you can kind of imagine, if you don't think through it all the way, that it's balanced, and so we're okay. I have a perspective, and then I'm going to ask you guys to comment, and it relates to the idea that Keith mentioned, and that's time compression. So when I look at this problem, I look at it from a background of thinking about enterprise risk and opportunity. What the general principles of hygiene from a security perspective have not changed. Christoph, Christopher, you talked about this at length, and none of these principles are new. What has changed, in my opinion, is you have an exponential compression, not a shortening. You have an exponential compression of the react time that Keith was talking about. Why? Essentially, we all have heard the term script kiddies, right? All right, script newbies that are out there, malicious actors, etc. This is the first time that a script kiddie has weapons grade cyber access. And I want to like reinforce that point. This is weapons grade cyber. And that group will always outnumber defenders, no matter what. And that combination, that deadly combination of mass proliferation with such capability. So it's like we replicated all of the best hackers in the world and we just unleashed them. Now there's millions of them. And that has a massive effect on the security posture of an enterprise in the sense that it's not, oh, we need to be just, it's not just that we need to be part of Glasswing. We also, and this jumps on your comment, Keith, and I'd love for you guys to expand on this. There also needs to be a massive increase in investment around addressing the vulnerabilities that are found. Because it's not just, ooh, all right, we have a new tool in the toolkit. You have a new tool and you have essentially an Armageddon level wave of attack coming in. So I'll pause there for a second. That was a very long-winded question, but what do you, if you were talking to the folks here who are ultimately advising or determining the security posture of their enterprises, what would you suggest they do, even just to understand the magnitude of the problem?
Yeah, I would like if I were a system admin, an architect, a someone who was responsible for understanding threat,
Mm,
like from a very simple perspective to help understand the magnitude of it. I take the output of my security scanner. I have my little Spark on my desk now, and I run an assessment of that through my local LLM to really understand it because I'm going to look like I've seen these outputs from the scanners. It is too much data to process. Even the dashboards really don't give us a really great view of that. And if you're definitely afraid of giving your local data set to a public, your local security vulnerability data set to a public LLM, I'm with you on that. Don't.
mm,
That's probably not a good idea.
mm,
But what is a good idea is for you to actually get like what I just did with, I love that we started the process off with giving it a template and then establishing, easy way to take my lab notes, my geek data, and put it in a presentable way. LLMs are experts at that. So give Gemma for the context. I'm trying to understand our security posture with Mythos, right? On the heels of being released. Here's our current security scanner. Build a tool that analyzes this, categorize the problems, and tell me where my top vulnerabilities and exposures at from and start from the bottom up. Hopefully there's no, tens on the list, but those two, threes, and ones, where does this simple LLM that is
mm,
not Mythos class, where can it see the chain of capability? Now create a report to my executive team to help them understand the level of problem and help us curate a plan for remediation because that's the hard part. Yes, I understand the vulnerability, but how do we fix it when culturally I can't get the application owner to patch the application that he owns because he or she has been able to consistently get exceptions from the business because we can't take the risk of patching the system and the service going down. We're now at the point that we can now quantify exactly what that risk is versus the business impact if we patch it and it fails.
mm,
Yeah, yeah. I think I mean that's great advice. I would sort of echo that and say, I mean, trying to understand, your assets, trying to understand those vulnerabilities, running it through an LLM, try to prioritize makes a lot of sense. trying to work on containment, like segmentation, microsegmentation. Think about shields, compensating controls for those. Um, think about the governance of, okay, how can we quickly react? Because if you want to, if you're an organization and it takes, so why do we patch only infrequently? Because we're afraid of outages, right? You have to take a downtime, you have to do it on Saturday. And so you can't afford that. So how can you actually do these patches? What's the muscle that you have to build to go into this patching cycle and add new rules or block certain access without that fear of disrupting that the business? And how can you get to actually an automation, right? How can you be comfortable in automating responses to these attacks because they operate at machine speed, and so you need to respond in machine speed. But if you don't actually dare to let your agent do anything, and you always have 4 levels of approval in the process that takes 2 weeks, then you don't win anything. There's actually a great document. I don't know if maybe many have seen it. It's called the Day Zero Normal. I think Rob Fuller and a bunch of other people wrote it. Happy to post the link also. It's not a Cisco document, but I think it's a great overview of what can be done, and it actually points to potential. Here are some areas in which you should invest. Here are some of the governance that you need to improve, and some of what I said, I think, is definitely inspired by that document. So that's what I think.
You know, no, please finish your thought.
No, that's it. I just wanted to add one thing on, when you said, hey, the speed, that compression, I think is absolutely right. I would even say, to make it worse is now there's that scale problem of in the past, the attackers focused on some targets because they were the juiciest ones. And so now they can, of course, target everything, right? And so this idea that you could get by because you're this irrelevant small company over there, that of course is out of the window, right? So in some sense, now everybody has to do this, unfortunately.
Security by obscurity is
Yeah,
officially dead, right?
exactly.
Officially dead.
Yeah.
If I were to underline an essence in both of your commentaries, it's the idea that the security posture itself, regardless of tooling, okay, let's accept for argument's sake that everybody has the same tools, be it the script kiddie who's looking at the attacks for everyone, as well as the defenders. There's a fundamental change, though, and you just talked about it, Chris, that I believe is critical, and I'm not sure how enterprises will do it, which is you have to release the idea of the human in the loop. If you hold on to that with both hands, which boards that are subject to compliance are going to do, you are going to lose. So this hasn't been solved. There's a regulatory angle to all this, but it's something that I'm hoping this community, I mean, if we do this right, this community could potentially become effectively a de facto standardization community around how we address this and what are those templates for the modern security organization. And that's always going to have to be a combination of humans, but then armies of agents. And you also said one other critical point, which, just in the interest of time, and I do want to get to some of the questions that are in the Q&A. You mentioned something else, Chris, that I think is important for everybody to consider, which is the idea that your controls, your compensating controls, can't be limited at the perimeter. I mean, we've all known that for a long time. NDRs, XDRs, all that kind of good stuff, looking at lateral movement, those are all good things. That model of internally looking for aberrant behavior needs to move to the semantic end.
Hmm.
And when you do that, that's like a third dimension of the security problem. Yeah, no great answers at this point. Yeah, I wish we had them, but a subject that I'd love to explore further inside of the TVR. All right, I'm going to switch gears, gentlemen, if I can, and go directly to some of the questions folks have asked. So I'm going to rewind us all the way back. We were talking about skills and malicious skills, and you got to be careful about where you go and you get the things that you are enabling your agents with. One of the questions, Marcelo, thank you very much. He asks, and it was during Keith's piece, you don't recommend building your own skills instead, with a question mark. Okay, and that is a simple question with a very critical implication. Does an organization just say we will never allow external skills to be used inside of our enterprise perimeter. I'll pass it to you guys.
Yeah, Chris has already commented on this, and I'll make sure I drive home. Well, we talked about this a little bit, but that's like saying I'll never use a SaaS product because I now have AI and I can build my own solutions. There are
Yep.
always going to be edge cases, edge tests, like the community, the power of the community testing against open source software has been proven out. This is no longer a debate. Is open source software good for security? Yes. When the adversaries have access to it, but the community does, and the power of community is much more powerful than our myopic view of these tools within our organization.
Okay, so your answer is you can't just hard limit it. You need to trust that the community will do what it has always done, which is help create a legitimate source of code that is verified by a large group of people with the same objective.
Yeah, and it's hard for me to think that Chris, as an academic, will disagree that peer review is really, really, really important. And the organizations have culture; they have their view of how the world works. And to your earlier point, Richard, is that I want to drive home a point that you made. Script kiddies are not just they don't just have master and doctorate degrees now in capability. They can now do exactly what I did earlier. And they have the thing that they want to do. They have the social engineering thing that they want to, the vector that they want to attack. And now they have the tools to build those attacks without waiting for the rest of their community to build those tools. So we can only counter this scale of community on the adversary side with our own community of white hats.
Right. It's like
No,
every
no,
script kid
I
has a
agree.
world class security researcher who is is beholden to whatever they want them to do. So just take the best security researcher or hacker in the world and chain them to somebody with malicious intent. That is a radical change in the architecture. Chris, you were going to say something.
Yeah, no, I agree with this. I just wanted to, say yes. I agree that with Keith, obviously, open source peer review, I 100% support it. But if you basically limit yourself and do everything yourself, I think you will just create problems in the speed in which you can innovate on the marketplace. And so it's almost not an option, right? Maybe it's a short-term solution, maybe it's a short-term fix while you bring up governance and processes and policies to make sure that you can use it safely. But eventually, you know, if you have those types of guardrails, your developers will work around it, and then you basically just have shadow skills, right? And so you'd better give people access and to the things they need to be, competitive. And yeah, I don't think that you can limit it.
Well,
Uh,
I mean, I inherently agree. I would say, just jumping on your response there, Keith, I agree, and Chris just did as well around the idea the intrinsic value of peer review and open source is still there and will always be there. But I think maybe what we need to do is define the idea of what the community is slightly differently. Right now, the community is people. What it needs to move to is a community of both people and defender. No, I don't know how you would do this, but defender certified, white hat certified agents. That's the community that also needs to weigh in because we will not get to the speed required, which is Chris's point, if we try to do this in the same way we have done it before. The concept is valid. The method by which we implement community review has to change. And that itself is an entire open standardization question, right?
Yeah,
Like,
so you asked a question earlier about human in the loop. Like human in the loop does not scale. It is not the option. You can't, have this incredible tool in agentic AI and then have it controlled by human gates. What needs to happen, and I've started some early research and testing on this, is a term that I've called deterministic code in the loop. So this ability to say, okay, let's take a migration by
mm,
default. I am not going to point a migration agent at my infrastructure and say move from one infrastructure to another infrastructure. I don't trust that. What I do trust is my playbooks. So I have a set of playbooks that are deterministic. I have application tests. I can chain this in a way that an agent proposes a path, runs a migration based on the qualifying playbook. If the playbook doesn't exist, that's the hard stop and
right.
the system exits out. If the playbook exists, it runs, and then these deterministic tests that are developed
Mm,
directly for the new environment run. That is not that's not the LLM deciding. That's some deterministic process. Doesn't have to be necessarily code, but there has to be. And I think, Richard, this is what you're hinting to. The community has determined what good looks like. The
mm,
question is, what are those deterministic tests that I can run against it so that vendors like Cisco, Palo Alto, etc., can now create systems that can scale to run these deterministic tests against that infrastructure. I think I'm biased because that's the design that I came up in my head, but you can't scale AI with human in the code. It has to be systematic in a way that can be tested. And that's my working theory, but I'm just one person. So
Yeah,
I do
I think
need
that's
the extended velocity community to help me out with this thinking.
now that be, I mean, I just want to make sure that this is an amplified point because I actually 100% believe in this as well. And I think there are a lot of signs that you see that this is true, from software development, where obviously things have to pass through test gates before it can be merged, to when we were AICC competing, we used oracles, right? Where the LLMs came up with hypotheses, but they were deterministic oracles to check and give feedback, right? It's like this idea that coming up with a potential solution might be hard, but checking if it works is actually comparably easier and can be done deterministically, right? And so if you have that loop where you can have the agent do the heavy lifting of come up with potential solutions or potential migration path, whatever you want, right? And then you check, well, does this actually work? If you can check that, that's super, super powerful. And even if they leaked Claude code, right? I mean, it's not just a wrap around LLMs, right? There's a lot of systems work that goes
yeah.
into this harnessing. And so not even Anthropic believes everything is LLM. So having
Mhm.
harness with deterministic code is, I think, super, super important.
We need to turn the asymmetry on the attack side to an advantage on the defense side, right? And we need to invoke that asymmetry of capability internally for our defenders. All right, I'm going to switch gears again. Fascinating conversation, gents. Um, we have an anonymous attendee. It's too bad you didn't want to tell us your name, but welcome. And the question is, and I'm interested in the answer to this myself. Are there any legitimate training slash certificates that you can recommend to help both the average user and IT operators adjust and prepare accordingly? So, if I were to add the Piazzantine spin to this, what is the state of the art in bringing people up to speed on the problem sets that we're facing in this conversation, if you're aware of any?
Yeah,
Yeah,
unfortunately, I'm not. So
I'll give Chris I'll give Chris I've been thinking about this, and
yeah.
I've been in this industry for 28 years, and I've not seen anything move this fast. And I really, and I went through all of, the certifications that I have, Security Plus, blah, 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 blah. I have them all. I have Cisco certifications, and all of them feed into my cumulative knowledge around security.
Mhm.
And there is not one certification. Like this is, and Chris, I love your input on this. It's not one discipline, right? It's all of my years of knowledge around getting hacked, having public SQL instances on the web with default password, like all the arrows in my back, plus my training, plus my advanced degree that equips me. That's not the answer you want to hear, but that's the reality of like the level of complexity of where the problem exists today, at least in my mind.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have a good answer. I was hoping that you had the answer for this, Keith. But I agree with you. It's about the you have to be in some sense curious and experiment with this yourself and kind of get that exposure. I mean, if students come to me, right, and they say, hey, I'm interested in security, are there certificates I can take? Unfortunately, I cannot point them to one. You know, what I would normally do, and this is in security, that there's something called Pwn College, PWN.college. It's an environment that a former student of mine who's now at ASU created, and you can play capture the flag challenges. It's basically an environment where you can, in different security areas, just play around. And yes, that kind of gives you that practical experience. You explore it, you play around with it, use it yourself, the technology, especially in a fast evolving field. I don't have found any other substitute. Obviously, if you go and you learn about computer science in general, you take computer science classes, all this builds that body of knowledge because security is very horizontal, right? You need to know about a lot of different things. But yeah, I wish there was an easy answer and say like take this AI security certificate and you're good to go. Unfortunately, I don't know either.
This is perhaps a self-serving comment, but and it's not the answer I think that new people coming into the workforce want to hear. But ultimately, the release of the general availability of these technologies, I believe, is a renaissance for people that have gray hair. Why? Right? So where we typically, you know, don't perform as well as we don't know the latest and greatest, code skill, the latest and greatest language, the latest and greatest, etc. But what we do have, and this is that muscle memory that you're both referring to, right? That cumulative knowledge set. What we do have is systems understanding, which means once you get over that first barrier, and maybe this is a potential, at least suggestion to the questioner. Once you get over that first barrier of understanding how to use this tooling most effectively, suddenly it unleashes a capacity for people with systems knowledge to do things that they otherwise couldn't. And that's another scaling element in the Defender toolkit, right? We have a lot of security professionals out there that know a lot of things and see patterns. Now we've just made, and this is why I'm an AI optimist, okay? Because I believe if you just take as a snapshot the idea that we just made every human being in the planet 1,000 times more effective, what problems will we solve? Right? All of them. Okay? I believe that intrinsically. Now I have a giant off switch and 1,000 gallons of propane in a backup generator, but I am an optimist on the outcomes. So I think the my own experience and building on what you guys are saying is be curious, experiment, learn as much as humanly possible, and I use that word intentionally, and then use this tooling to expand your ability to comprehend and execute.
We will be sending this out. The recording will be available on the TVR website and on our TVR YouTube as well. So again, just want to thank everybody for participating. Gentlemen, fascinating conversation. I appreciate the comments and questions in the chat, and certainly more to come from the TVR room and this exciting AI time that we are all living in. So with that, we will end the webinar. Thank you very much for participating, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Builder. Cheers, gents.